Viewer discretion is advised before we begin, as this story is purely for entertainment. Now, let your imagination run wild. One of television's most immovable icons has just walked into arguably the most unforgiving interview of his entire career. Explosive, wildly unpredictable, and unbeknownst to even a seasoned performer like Steve Harvey, a storm was waiting on the other side of the cameras. He stepped into that studio expecting an easy back and forth, the kind of warm conversation he'd mastered 1,000 times before. After all, The View had always been a comfortable arena for daytime TV regulars. But this time, something was different. What unfolded next felt less like a chat and more like a carefully laid ambush one that left audiences stunned and sparked nationwide debates for weeks. But before we get into the meat of this on-air feud, hit that subscribe button and drop your thoughts below. Which talk show host do you think reigns supreme with their ways of handling the drama live on air? Just wait till the end of this breakdown. You might never look at polished daytime television the same way again. Because this wasn't some simple interview gone bad. This was a masterclass in tension. Ego against ego. Charm colliding with hostility. The unpredictable chaos that only live TV can deliver. It all started with what seemed like a normal Tuesday morning. Steve Harvey walked onto set of The View wearing his megawatt smile, the very expression which millions associate with hilarity, wisdom, and of course, that unmistakable Steve Harvey panache. Wearing a crisp navy suit and perfectly patterned tie, he looked every inch the confident veteran tugging his jacket in that signature manner with effortless authority. The crowd just went wild, erupting instantly into cheers across the bright lights and camera lenses. These were longtime supporters, people who grew up just watching him, faces lighting up at the very moment he appeared. The room buzzed with excitement in honor of a man who knew how to connect with the crowd like few others. His hosts Whoopi Goldberg, Sarah Haynes, and Sunny Hostin received him with open warmth. Whoopi leaned forward, that inimitable blend of experience and welcome radiating from her, ready to steer the interview as smoothly as ever. But then there was Joy Behar. She sat at the far end of the table, hunched like a predator sizing up its prey. Her body angled away, arms folded tightly, expression unreadable. While the rest of them practically shone with positivity, Joy's stare was razor-sharp, silent, focused, and unsettling. Steve felt the shift immediately. Years under the bright lights had honed his instincts, and something about her posture triggered a silent warning. Still, he brushed it off. Live TV jitters, he told himself. Steve Harvey, everybody. Whoopi declared as the applause rose again. We are happy he's here with us today. Thanks for having me. Steve replied, flashing that legendary grin. The grin that had earned him his place as one of entertainment's favorite personalities. Always great to sit with you ladies. First to chime in was Sarah, her delivery particularly enthusiastic. Steve, so your latest relationship book is doing wonderfully. What motivated you to pen another relationship help book? Steve leaned into the conversation with confidence. This was his comfort zone, relationships, family dynamics, humorous storytelling. It was time to deliver. Well, Sarah, he began smoothly. After so many years hosting Family Feud and speaking with families from every background, one thing became crystal clear. Communication is everything. He launched into stories of the couples he'd encountered over the years. The newlyweds, the long-timers struggling to stay afloat, the ones hanging on by a thread, and those unable to find the words with which to say what mattered. He blended humor and hard truth with such finesse. He held the room in the palm of his hand. The audience listened intently, nodding enthralled. But though Steve was commanding the stage, the camera switched, and there was Joy again. No nodding, no smile, no hint of friendliness. Her eyes were locked on him, her stare narrowing like a blade being sharpened. Her expression didn't just signal disagreement. It warned of something brewing just beneath the surface. What came next would have torn the amiable veneer of the studio and turned the whole interview on its head. The laughter evaporated, and the studio was taken over by the palpable tension in it. The unshakable men within entertainment were about to be put through a ringer like no other. Steve Harvey leaned forward, his voice low and measured, yet commanding. That is when couples don't really listen to the other person anymore that the real problems start, he said, every word oozing the consistent calmness of a seasoned veteran. The audience murmured in agreement, beyond impressed by his wisdom, his humor, his effortless command of authority. Absolutely beautiful, Sonny added, offering a supporting smile. And the reviews for your book have been phenomenal, Sarah chimed in, her tone so warm and enthusiastic. Everything was perfectly normal, just as it should be, until Joy Behar shifted in her seat. Coiled like a spring, her body moved with deliberate precision, while the rest were sober in expression, all hardness, unyielding and coldly focused. Every movement insinuated a calculated strike, just dying to fall. Steve, trained to read a room in an instant, felt the air shift. A chill ran across the studio. "Joy, you look like you've got something to say," he said lightly, trying to defuse the mounting tension with a chuckle. But it was too late. Her eyes sharpened just a fraction, a tiny shift, but one that carried a world of threat. "Well, Steve," she began slowly, with deliberate syllables, "I've been reading your book, and I have to ask, isn't it a little hypocritical for someone who's been married 3 times to give relationship advice?" The room froze. The applause, the laughter, the background chatter all vanished. Sonny's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. Sarah's smile collapsed. Even Whoopi's eyes widened a silent acknowledgement that the conversation had crossed into hostile territory. For the first time, Steve Harvey's $1,000,000 smile flickered just long enough for the audience to glimpse the sting, but he recovered, masterful as ever. "My experiences," he said aloud, calm but firm, "both triumphs and challenges, give insight into what works and what doesn't. Every relationship teaches us something." He pressed his hands together on the table, a subtle anchor against the storm brewing across from him. Joy wasn't interested in the lessons. Leaning forward, she sliced through the studio air with the intensity of her voice. "But Steve, you've openly talked about your first 2 marriages ending in divorce. How can you sit here and tell others how to make theirs work when you couldn't make yours?" Whoopi sprang instinctively to intervene. "Joy, I think with Steve." "Let him answer." Joy snapped, her raised hand cutting her off. The audience gasped collectively. Even off camera, the producers were frozen in place. "Our viewers deserve to know," Joy continued, her voice sharp and accusatory, "why they should trust relationship advice from someone with that track record." Steve slowly inhaled, his jaw tightening not in anger, but in sheer control. Even under this relentless personal assault, he kept his poise. "Well," he said, voice steady but edged with firmness, "I've been happily married to my wife Marjorie for over 15 years. We have a beautiful blended family. And yes, I've learned from my past mistakes. That's what growth looks like." Joy's laughter then cut like a knife through the studio. "Growth?" she sneered. "Or is it just good marketing?" A ripple went through the audience. Joy folded her arms, her posture a fortress of judgment. "How convenient," she pressed, "that your personal struggles turn into best-selling books." The room erupted into uneasy murmurs at that. Sarah put a hand over her mouth. Sonny hunched as if ready to spring across the table. And even Whoopi, seemingly unflappable, shifted in her seat. It was out of control, live, and unscripted. In a situation Steve Harvey could not control. The stakes went higher, and the air in the studio crackled with anticipation of what would happen next. But Joy wasn't finished, not by a long shot. "And another thing, Steve," she said, her voice dropping to that chilly calm. "Those comedy specials from the 90s, some of that material about women hasn't aged very well, has it?" Her words fell like precise, calculated blows. "So, how can anyone be sure your relationship advice isn't just more the same outdated thinking?" Steve set his coffee mug on the table, the thud echoing through the studio, amplified by the microphones. It was not a gentle gesture. Rather, it was a sound of patience stretched thin to breaking point of a man bracing for the storm. He turned fully toward her, squaring his shoulders as quiet defiance emanated from his body. "Joy," he said, voice even but an edge of steel, "I came here to talk about helping people build stronger relationships, not to be judged for jokes I made decades ago as a comedian. Comedy evolves. People evolve. And I think my track record speaks for itself." The moment 1 or 2 tentative claps broke through, a greater number sat in silence and shock at the raw intensity of what was unfolding live before them. It wasn't a debate. It was a full-on interrogation. Steve Harvey, never touched, was holding his own like a warrior. Joy's response was instant, cutting without mercy. Because from where I'm sitting, Steve, it looks a lot like you're profiting from giving advice on something you've struggled with your entire life. A low murmur ran through the crowd. Steve blinked, the verbal jab landing with visible impact. He opened his mouth to respond, but Joy didn't pause. She leaned in, twisting the knife with every word. And frankly, she said, stressing frankly with deliberate sting, some of your remarks about women in the past suggest you might not be the best person to be telling them how to find love. The studio froze. Sonny's jaw dropped slightly. Sarah looked ready to vanish into the floor. Even Whoopi Goldberg, no stranger to chaos on live television, seemed momentarily stunned by just how far Joy was willing to push this confrontation. Leaning forward, Whoopi attempted to interject. Perhaps we can talk about any of the positive responses to the book that... No, Whoopi, Steve interrupted, calm but now hard, his voice an edge slicing right through. He swung to Joy, his eyes locking with her. Every inch of his was a man who had reached his limit. Joy wants to have this conversation, he said, voice low and steady. Fine, let's have it. It was as if the studio around them had changed. The air thickened, charged, crackling with tension. You're sitting here trying to tear me down in front of millions of viewers, he pursued, his eyes piercing. For what? What's your agenda here? Joy leaned back, a slow, satisfied smirk curling across her face. My agenda is truth, Steve, she replied smugly. I think our viewers deserve to know who they're taking advice from. And honestly, she added, tilting her head with condescension, your defensive reaction is pretty telling. That was the spark. Steve's eyes narrowed, posture snapping upright, the calm veneer replaced by controlled power. Defensive? He repeated, his voice rising, not yelling, but swelling with authority. You're attacking my character, my marriage, my career, and you expect me to sit here and just smile and nod? That's not happening, ladies and gentlemen. Joy, predictably, was far from done. Steve Harvey, everybody, she said with much sarcasm, opening her arms, as if introducing a failed performance. This is what happens when you get legitimate questions thrown at him. He falls apart. That was the line. The scrape of Steve's chair against the studio floor cut like a gunshot. In an instant, he was on his feet. The sudden movement jolted everyone. Sarah gasped. Sonny instinctively reached out, and Whoopi's eyes darted to the frozen production crew. Steve planted both hands on the table, his presence dominating the room. It was a new, electrified stage in the showdown, and nobody watching could take their eyes away. Leaning toward Joy, Steve's posture was commanding, without any sense of aggression, unshakable. I'm not falling apart, Joy, he said in a low and resonant and firm voice. I'm calling out your unprofessional behavior. He let the words hang in the charged silence of the studio. This isn't journalism, he continued slowly, deliberately. This is you trying to create a moment. Joy's eyebrows rose in a faint amusement. But for the first time, the smirk on her face wavered just a tiny crack that the audience could feel. Steve had struck harder than she anticipated. The tension had mounted up to levels very few segments of daytime television could claim. Around the nation, viewers leaned into their screens. In the studio, the audience collectively held its breath, caught between witnessing a live explosion and the potential collapse of an interview. Steve Harvey, the master of calm humor, was standing his ground with fire no one saw coming, and everyone would be talking about it. This is character assassination, Steve pronounced, his voice slicing through the still air like a bolt of thunder. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the lights overhead seemed deafening. Audience members' hands were clamped over their mouths as their eyes widened in disbelief. Some were leaning way forward, as if terrified to blink and miss 1 second of the unfolding drama. Others looked as though they were genuinely disturbed. What began as light-hearted television had just turned raw, uncomfortable, and intensely personal. The co-host froze. Sonny threw a nervous glance toward Whoopi. Sarah clenched her note cards in her hands until her knuckles turned white. No one knew whether to intercede or stay out of line of fire. Sit down, Steve, Joy ordered sharply, struggling again for the upper hand. Sit down? Steve scoffed, a small bitter laugh escaping him. tinged with hurt rather than humor. Joy, you spent the last 10 minutes trying to humiliate me on national television, and you think I'm the one embarrassed? He gestured toward the audience, then zeroed his eyes back on hers. You know what's embarrassing? A grown woman who thinks bullying is good television. Joy's face flamed. Bullying? I'm asking legitimate questions. Questions any responsible journalist would ask. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be on talk shows. Legitimate questions? Steve echoed, his voice sharpened with incredulity. Joy, you began this interview with an attack. You didn't inquire about my book. You didn't inquire about my family, my work, my philanthropy, nothing. You went right for the throat the second I sat down. That is not journalism. That is a hit job. Oh, please. Joy scoffed, her eyes rolling in exaggerated disdain. You're being dramatic. This is how interviews work in the real world. Steve, we don't just throw softball questions at you so you can promote your book. Steve's composure cracked finally. He pointed directly at her. Joy, I've done thousands of interviews in my career. I've graced every major network, every flagship program. I know the difference between a challenging question and a targeted takedown, and what you're orchestrating falls squarely into the second category. From the dumbfounded silence, finally, a flustered Whoopi found her voice, hands raised in a desperate attempt to intervene. Perhaps we should... No, Steve cut her off, his words a cold blade slicing through the room. Joy ignited this, and we will finish it here, now. The audience gasped. Not a single soul in the room host's crew or audience was prepared for a guest to hijack a live broadcast. Joy crossed her arms over her chest, a shield of defiance. She angled herself back, her expression a mask of provocation. All right, Steve, let's see this through, she said, surging forward, eyes locking onto us like a predator. You want to speak of personal assaults? Let's talk about you, she snapped, jabbing a finger at him. Let's dissect the empire you built on the backs of female caricatures, on jokes at their expense, reducing them to punchlines, and now you dare to reinvent yourself as some sage of relationships. The studio felt like shrinking under the weight of her accusation. The air was electric. Every heartbeat in that room was a countdown to the moment no one would forget. A harsh, derisive scoff escaped Joy's lips, audacity almost palpable. At Steve's sides, his hands clenched into fists, not in threat, but in a desperate effort to contain the storm raging within, anger, hurt, and sheer bewilderment. Joy, he said, voice low, strained, a call for reason to chaos. You obviously have some deeply rooted anger toward me. This much hostility. It's not protocol. He splayed his hands, a raw gesture of confusion. Did I slight you at some forgotten gala? Was there some careless word that hurt you sometime in the course of all this? Because this feels intensely personal. Don't flatter yourself, she snapped, ice in her tone. This has nothing to do with you personally. This is about public accounting. Accountability. Accountability, Steve repeated, the word tasting like ash. You cannot just erase your history. Joy pressed on, inexorably, with the requirement for universal amnesia from all in the room. My past, Steve's voice fractured, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of shock and cruelty. He stepped back slightly, drawing a deep breath that seemed to pull all the oxygen from the studio. Joy, my past is sleeping in a car because I had no home. My past is working every menial job just to survive. My past is clawing my way from nothing to build an enterprise that supports hundreds of families. My past is pouring millions into charitable causes, guiding the next generation comedians, lifting children who were dealt impossible hands. He gestured toward the silent audience, letting the gravity of his words land. But you want to crucify me for punchlines I delivered 30 years ago. Joy flapped her hand, dismissing it like a fly carrying an unpleasant reality. Oh, spare us the melodrama. The audience collectively gasped. Steve's life work, decades of hardship and triumph, reduced to a flick of her wrist. Countless people have overcome hardship, she continued, her voice dripping with condescension. But they didn't build a career by demeaning women. There was a heavy silence. Into the void, Sarah finally spoke, her voice a fragile thread of reason. Joy, I think we might. But it was too late. The line had been crossed. The confrontation had already cemented itself as one of the most volatile exchanges ever witnessed on daytime television, and the storm was far from over. It is a public dismemberment of a man's character, and that is what this is. Steve said, his voice rumbling like thunder in the studio. The atmosphere was heavy, charged like electricity. Audience members covered their mouths in incredulity at their luck. Some pressed themselves forward, prisoners of the spectacle, terrified to miss a second of it. Others looked unadulteratedly pained. What was supposed to be a light-hearted morning segment had become something raw, visceral, uncomfortably real. The co-hosts were statues at the table, frozen between instinct and fear. Sonny shot a panicked glance at Whoopi. Sarah's knuckles whitened as her fingers wrapped tightly around her note cards. The rules of engagement had VA.